Hello, everybody. Happy Friday. Happy New Year. I guess actually my last talk was already the New Year, so happy the New Year some more. Um, I hope everybody's doing okay given everything that's going on. You know, I pretend like I don't plan these talks um, with current events in mind. And I do and I don't, but sometimes things just sort of pan out. So I was already reading this really excellent book, um, The Devil's Historians by Amy Kaufman and Paul Sturdivant, which I strongly recommend that you read. It's a great read. Paul Sturdivant is somebody who I have spoken with and interviewed on my podcast. If you'd like to listen to that, it's really good. He's a really cool guy. Runs the Public Medievalist, is a public historian at the Smithsonian. Anyway, I was reading this book, great book, and I was already planning on doing this. And then there was a weird, half-assed, incredibly distressing, disturbing coup on Wednesday, coup attempt. And I, at some point, will maybe have something to say about that. But anyway, more now than ever, I'm sort of inspired to talk about how the alt-right especially, but really the right in general, and just a lot of people misuse and misunderstand um, history, especially the history of the Middle Ages. Oh, thank you, Matt. Yeah, feel free to check that out afterwards if you're interested. And the website is the Public Medievalist. There's a lot of really good stuff there. Um, but yeah, it was just there's if you're online at all, and I assume that a lot of you are, you're probably familiar with, the sort of like alt right approach to the Middle Ages, the use of, Middle Age inspired flags, medieval flags, things like, the phrase Deus Volt being shouted ironically and semi ironically. Um, by people who are legitimately white supremacists or bordering on it, and um, there's as they like to say, a lot going on there. Um, oops, but I want to sort of like break it down a little bit and talk about what what is going on there. Um, so hold on just a second while I fix something that is wrong with my presentation. All right, and we're back. Anyway, um, uh, I'm here. The FBI didn't get me yet. Um, so I want to talk to you about just what the fuck this is and where it comes from. Obviously, I'm going to be talking about some kind of unpleasant things, and some like pretty heavy topics. I'll be mentioning violence and sexual violence. So, be warned if that is distressing to you. Uh, you might not want to listen or listen to this afterwards. I'm gonna have to talk about it. So let's talk about the alt right. Viewer discretion is extremely advised. So here's let me make this big so you can see. Um, Obviously these dorks are carrying sticks and shields and helmets. I don't know. There's like they're like knight like, but you can see in the back there is specifically a Templar shield with the words Deus Volt written on it. I already said this, but that means God wills it. It is supposed to have been a Crusader battle cry. Questionable whether or not that's actually true. Um, but the alt right has this weird, just obsession, interest, appropriation of medieval symbols. This idea that they are modern day Crusaders. These guys, I believe, are part of the, and I hate this, but the Fraternal Order of Alt Knights, FOAK, which is the tactical defense arm of the Proud Boys, based around. I hate that I have to say these words. Based Stickman, a man who, yeah, I know this is ultimately like I'm gonna get to this at the end, but like this is all incredibly cringeworthy. Anyway, I have seen Based Stickman up close. Stood across from him at a number of um, protests here in Portland. He's a guy who shows up with a stick. He got famous for beating up somebody, I think, at a protest, some, black bloc person. Anyway, he um, formed his own part of the Proud Boys, again, the Fraternal Order of Alt Knights. Um, Karate Chop Whiskey asks a very good question, and yes, it is. I'm going to talk about this in greater detail a little bit later, but yeah, this is a common feature of nationalism. But the specifically like medieval inspired alt-right groups include things like the Wolves of Vinland, who claim to be, or are Nordic-inspired white supremacists who burned down a black church in Virginia. The Rebel Brigade Knights of the True Invisible Empire, a offshoot of the KKK, the Holy Nation of Odin, that harasses immigrants in Scandinavia. Anders Breivik, the terrorist who killed dozens of people, hundreds in Norway in 2012, I believe, in his manifesto spoke at length about the Middle Ages and restoring order and being the leader of a new order of Knights Templar. The Christchurch Killer, who live streamed his own murders, wrote, among other things, the name Charles Martel on his firearm, who was an 8th century duke who defeated an Arab army on his way to Tours in 732. Charles Martel is often like heralded, the Hammer, heralded as being the defender of Europe, but in truth, this battle was not really like this big clash of civilizations, but it doesn't matter. It's white supremacist horseshit. French terrorists have used his name in the 70s and 80s when they attacked Algerian businesses. Stephen Bannon, who we're going to talk about a little bit more, invoked this battle when he was calling upon the Catholic Church to take a stance to defend the Judeo-Christian West from terrorists. The Max murderer, Jeremy Joseph Christian, claimed when afterwards that he, who is a white supremacist and a white nationalist, claimed that he killed the people that he did on behalf of Vinland, the Nordic settlement here in America. Last year in Newark, a man attacked a Planned Parenthood with a Molotov cocktail, yelling "Deus Volt" as he did. Marine Le Pen, the alt-right leader of I forget the name of her French party, marches to the statue of Joan of Arc every year and frequently invokes a French medieval past. UKIP and other far-right British parties often invoke King Arthur and the Knights, St. George. St. George, by the way, was Armenian. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I don't know why I care, but anyway. They have this idea, right, of a purer, better, more just, more virtuous medieval past. And this isn't just like idiots. I mean, it's mostly idiots. It's mostly white supremacists. But there's pretensions of intellectualism, right? There's the Dark Enlightenment, which is it's just like nerd monarchy, but it's this elaborately overwritten philosophy by guys with names like Mencius Moldbug, which calls for us to return to a medieval past, a medieval inspired past, ruled by our betters. Who's Steve Bannon is a fan of this particular philosophy. So, what exactly is the deal here, right? What do these people believe, right? So the reason why they're attracted to the Middle Ages, to knights, to an imagined past, is because they believe that the Middle Ages were a more patriarchal, heteronormative, a more Christian, more nationalist time period. They also believe that it is more violent, and that the rule of might was prevalent, right, and that the strongest prevailed. and that it was cruel, and it essentially it justifies all of their beliefs about themselves and about the world, right? So there's two obvious problems with this, right? The one obvious problem is that it's really fucking like awful. It's like a nightmare ideology. These people are bad people who believe bad things. The other problem with this is that it's fucking wrong. Like, this is I mean, that's not actually what the Middle Ages is like. And so, part of why I wanted to talk about this is because it's so widespread, you can't go anywhere. I mean, I didn't pull any pictures from the insurrection on Wednesday, but there were Templar flags flying there. This is bonkers. But like, I just wanted to like get into like why they believe this. Like, why is this useful, and what does it mean? So, to begin with, when we're talking about the modern day, we have to talk about what I'm calling the Game of Thrones problem. And it's not just the Game of Thrones problem, but it's, I think, to me, first and foremost, the Game of Thrones problem. Any given person is substantially more likely to have seen Game of Thrones than to have read anything about the Middle Ages, anything truthful about the Middle Ages. They may have seen a picture book or something, but whether or not they consciously think, oh, Game of Thrones is a true representation of the Middle Ages, that is sort of their baseline, right? That is their subconscious bias. And it's not just Game of Thrones, it's Lord of the Rings too, which, the problem with both of these is, of course, that they're fiction. That's fine. But Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings both present what is perceived as a vision of the past. And so Game of Thrones, very famously, is quote unquote realistic, right? It portrays sexual violence and actual violence and cruelty and people being shitty to each other, because that's what life is like in the Middle Ages. Is everyone's mean and bad. I'm so sorry, everyone. Good question, Terwilliger Van Buren. I should lay down some groundwork. So the Middle Ages roughly refers to, and this is not a real time period, and it doesn't mean anything, but when we're talking about this, it's sometime around the fall of Rome, so 493, to the fall of Byzantium, or the beginning of the Renaissance. So imagine roughly the years 500 to 1400, 500 to 1500. This is purely a categorical thing. There's nothing really like unifying this, and when we talk about the Middle Ages, we're referring both to like a geographical area of England to China or Japan, depending on how you want to. So this is just sort of like a useful way of just thinking about things. It's also just we are stuck with the idea of the Middle Ages because that's how people have been talking about it for so long. So keep that very roughly in mind. We're mostly talking about, again, when people talk about the Middle Ages, they're talking about Western Europe from like 700, 800 to 1400. There's problems with that I'm going to talk about, but just bear that in mind. So Game of Thrones presents this, again, what is perceived as a realistic depiction of the past. And George R. R. Martin has spoken about this, when people press him on the the sexual violence, especially in the books, and he always says something like, well, that's just how it was. It was a dark time and I had to be realistic. So there's that, right? There's this perception that the Middle Ages were a time of unbelievable cruelty and violence and, sexual rapacity. And then there's the opposite problem, which is, sort of the Lord of the Rings idea, which is where, everyone is virtuous. Everyone is chaste and pure. The women are all, tall, beautiful elves. And the men are all knights, and anybody who's brown is a swarthy Easterner. I will defend J.R.R. Tolkien, but truth be told, his, some bad ideas have come from Lord of the Rings. So there's this idea, right? There's this imagined medieval past, right? Of chaste virgins, of Christian morality, of an orderly world, right, where you follow the king's directions and everybody has their place and there's a nice tidy patriarchy, and then it's merged with an idea of cruel violence and of might making right, of knights defending themselves and defending pure women from savage hordes, and there are elements of truth to this, but this is just not how it was. So let me go through a few of the things that are wrong with this. All right, so first and foremost, the idea that medieval lives were cruel, they were violent, they were short. People only had a life expectancy of 35 years old. I think you all know this, but this statistic, which is often trotted out, is confusing because it's an average. If you control for infant and childhood deaths, people who survived to young adulthood tended to live about as long as we do. They lived to be in their 70s, sometimes 80s. There were a lot more childhood deaths, but quite frankly, up until the mid-19th century, infant mortality was quite high everywhere in the world, including in the West. Excuse me. Wars were quite violent, of course, but I must really emphasize here that the type of violence and the volume of death that we moderns are capable of inflicting would make any medieval person absolutely appalled. The worst atrocities committed in the Middle Ages do not hold a candle to what we have done in the 20th century alone. It really, there were plenty of wars and there's plenty of violence and there was plenty of torture, but I don't know that there's really any evidence or suggestion that it was more violent than the world that we lived in. Despite also what Monty Python might have you believe, not everybody lived in filth and muck and died of pestilence. I've shown you here some Viking combs. I especially want to dwell on Vikings a bit because the way that people think about Vikings is super wrong. And I'll probably have to do a whole separate talk about that. But many medieval people were quite clean and healthy. Vikings especially were very well groomed. They would have put any 21st century metrosexual to shame. Is that still a thing? Do people still talk about metrosexuals? When was that? That was an early 2000s thing. Anyway, here's a quote from an English monk that was written in around the turn of the 13th century about Vikings, John of Wallingford. They were, the Vikings, according to their country's customs, in the habit of combing their hair every day, to bathe every Saturday, to change their clothes frequently, and to draw attention to themselves by means of many such frivolous whims. In this way, they sieged the married women's virtue and persuaded the daughters of even noble men to become their mistresses. The Vikings were pretty boys. They were not, savage berserker hordes. They were fancy lads who the English ladies were horny for. And on the matter of, again, sexual violence, again, Game of Thrones would have you believe that, women were, anytime they were unprotected, some asshole would come and rape them. But, there just is not, rape was, in many cases, still illegal. Assault was illegal. Women had some recourse, less, of course, than they do now. But there's no evidence that men were more likely to commit sexual violence in the Middle Ages than they are now. I don't need to tell you that rape is still quite common in the modern day in the United States. Marital rape was only outlawed in the United States in 1993. This is just nonsense. Is the thing. It's just there's this, I'm don't really like even hate Game of Thrones all that much, but there's just this idea that like it was, the Middle Ages was just a bunch of savages who could barely be controlled from, attacking any woman nearby is just it's just not how it is. Speaking of, the other thing, right, that the alt-right is sort of like celebrating, the right in general, but especially the alt-right is celebrating, is the idea that the Middle Ages were white, heteronormative, women were chaste, everybody was, had sex to produce children and nothing else. And this is also just so not true. What you're seeing here is the French novel Le Roman de Silence, the novel of silence, which concerns the adventures of Silentius, Silence, who is born a woman, and then raised as a boy to be eligible to inherit, since the King of England has outlawed the succession of women. Silence fights as well as any man does. She romances and does all sorts of knightly chivalric things. Her gender is incredibly fluid throughout. She is referred to by both male and female pronouns. And there's a substantial discussion in the book between sort of the avatars of nature and reason about, whether or not she should stay a woman or stay a man or become a man. This is just one of many examples of women and men subverting gender roles. It was not at all uncommon for a knight or a monk to reach the end of their life, and somebody would then discover that they had been, they had genitalia that did not match their gender expression. And exactly as Jay Biddy says, the Middle Ages were hella gay. I don't want to overemphasize this because there's no really way to measure it, but there's a lot of evidence that in monasteries and nunneries that, people weren't going there just to worship God, I guess is what I'm saying. A lot of those people were, were chaste and pure, holy folks, but also maybe you were the type of guy who wanted to spend the rest of his life around young, holy, virtuous other men, and maybe they liked that too. Even within that, if you read a lot of, or even outside of that, if you read a lot of chivalric literature, the knights were constantly professing their affection for each other. They were, if one of them would be slain in battle, they would throw themselves on their corpse, kiss them on the lips, weep, right, over their fallen brother. This is distressing to me, like actively as a 21st century man. But in a lot of ways, the range of like emotional expression that was available to a medieval knight is greater than what is available to a man today. They cried, they wrote love poems, they expressed all manner of what would now be called womanly emotions. And this is just quite common. Also, people were not chaste. They were not pure. There were all kinds of course, church laws and other laws against adultery and against, fornication, whatever. But that did not really stop people from being horny. And they were really horny. There were just like a lot of bawdy poems, a lot of naughty songs, a lot of just very like filthy, images passed around. Some of them written by holy people. Clerics and priests were not, immune to this. This idea of the Middle Ages as just this, knightly virtue and pure women, is not true, even among the nobility, where it might have been like ostensibly true. They were just as horny and they cheated just as much, and they were, every bit as lascivious as any modern person might imagine. So furthermore, right, the real thing, right, the real like critical part of this is, of course, this idea that the Middle Ages, medieval Europe especially, was very, very white, right? That it was just a bunch of white people doing white people things, and that's why the alt-right and all these people want to return to sort of like a purer version of the past. It will not surprise you that this is also wrong. Um, it's actually not true at all. I want to like first emphasize that when we talk about the Middle Ages, during this time, Europe is a backwater. Europe is, the ass end of an ass end continent. The real action is in Byzantium, in the Middle East, in China, Japan, India. What's actually like what actually matters in the world is happening elsewhere, and that's not any reason not to care about Europe. But it's when you're talking about returning to an idealized past, I might pick something else. And within that, there was plenty of cross-cultural exchange. You see right here. This question is bugging me. All right. Okay. Very good joke, Genghis Kondo. This is Saint Maurice. Saint Maurice was the leader of the legendary Roman Theban Legion. He is venerated for. The story goes that they were ordered to kill a group of Christians, and he chose not to. So he was sainted for this. Saint Maurice is black. He's obviously black. He's black in every painting that there is of him, and every statue. There are paintings and statues of him all over Europe celebrating him. Vikings were not all white. I also want to emphasize that Viking is a job title, not an ethnicity, and the Viking Empire stretched from, England all the way to, the Red Sea. The Byzantine Empire contained all sorts of people who were not white. Italy had an incredible amount of exchange with both Northern Africa and the Middle East. Arthur's knights, 3 of them were Muslims: Sir Palomides, Sir Saphir, and Sir Segawardis. One of them, Sir Morayan, was black. This is just not true. It's just I don't want to suggest that there were like a lot of non-white people in Europe before the modern day, but there were some. There's not a lot of black people in Portland today, but that doesn't mean that they're clearly here and they clearly matter and are clearly part of the story. Race in the Middle Ages also, it's worth noting, doesn't work the way that modern racists believe that it does. I don't want to suggest that there's some sort of like enlightened opinion towards toward race in the Middle Ages, because it's not true either. They had some really weird ideas about it, but there was not chattel slavery. There was not a belief that you were, there was some sort of like biological truth to your skin color. There was plenty of bigotry and plenty of exclusion, but it was largely around your religion and, where geographically you came from, less than your skin color. Medieval people would not really have recognized the sort of like racial doctrines that we take for granted today. And this is just one of those things that's sort of assumed when people talk about the Middle Ages. And every time there's even a token, non-white person included in any, piece of media, everyone flips their shit. But truthfully, it just wasn't like that. Similarly, one of the other, big myths, the things that the right loves to sort of like believe in and harp on, is that there was this sort of like uniformly Christian, religiously, justified kingdom and that they all, all these brave knights and crusaders defended Europe from the savage Muslim hordes. And this is also just not true. Outside of Europe, the Mongol Empire ruled, one of the greatest swaths of land ever. And within the Mongol Empire, there were dozens of different religions that lived in relative harmony. The Mongols didn't care what you did or who you worshipped as long as you paid your taxes. Italy also had a substantial, during this time, again, Jews, Christians, Muslims living alongside by side. It sometimes gets overemphasized, but a lot of you may have heard of the sort of the period of convivencia in Iberian Spain when it was ruled by Muslims, Jews, Christians, and Muslims living together in relative peace and harmony. There was a great deal of friction, but they did live together until, again, the Christian kings expelled all the Jews and Muslims, but lived together in harmony. There was a great deal of intellectual and spiritual exchange, cultural exchange. There were periods of great tolerance in the Middle Ages as well. It was not the rule that Jews or Muslims were the enemy, and that they were being fought by crusaders at all times. It is worth noting that that is especially bad in England and France, the treatment of Jews especially, but that's not the entirety of the Middle Ages. In fact, it's worth noting that the Crusaders, when they were doing their crusading, tended to kill an awful lot of people who were not Muslim as well. If you were around for my talk on the Fourth Crusade, they ransacked Byzantium, which was a Christian city, as well as several Christian cities on the port or on the coast, just because they needed money. They crusaded against pagans in Europe, and one of the most famous phrases, which you're probably familiar with, "Cadite eos, noet enim dominus qui sunt eos." Kill them all, and God will know his own. If this is familiar to you, this actually comes from the Albigensian Crusade, which was a military campaign initiated by Pope Innocent III to eliminate Cathars in southern France. They were heretics, but they were Christians. They believed, they were Gnostics. They believed in a good and a evil God. Again, the Crusaders, they did a lot of killing of other Christians. Hello, Killer Keith and Professional Cuddle. The maps behind me are topographical maps of Oregon. So anyway, also not true. So where the fuck do they get these ideas? Well, I'm so glad you asked where I get those ideas from. Topographical? Did I say it wrong? I am drinking whiskey. Am I being rated? There's a lot of newcomers here. I'm going to keep on going. So these things come from, these ideas are purely modern ideas. So one of the things that is often associated with the Middle Ages is witch burnings. Witch burnings, while they did happen sometime in the Middle Ages, really didn't catch on until the 1500s. This is the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of the Witches, which was published in 1487, right? And didn't really catch on until the 1500s. The worst witch burnings were much later. As you all us fine Americans know, the Salem witch burnings were in the late 17th century. They were distinctly not medieval. Biblical literalism, right? The idea that the Bible is entirely true and literal as its interpretation, that it can be read exactly as it is written down, is an idea from the 19th century. Hasidic Judaism, also 19th century. Wahhabism, the idea behind a lot of modern terrorism, 18th century. These are modern ideas. I'm not going to talk about Nazis yet. If you wait, I'm going to get to Nazis. Hold your horses, though. And this is just the first example of sort of like where these modern ideas come from, right? The idea of the Middle Ages, as we conceive of it, is more about modern ideas and how they've interpreted the past. And it begins with, or it doesn't begin with, but it sort of like takes off with sort of a Victorian Restoration, right? Many of you may be familiar with the classic book Ivanhoe, written by Sir Walter Scott. You may or may not be aware that Ivanhoe was written in 1820, and Walter Scott was part of a sort of Victorian restoration of the past. A lot of European nations, especially England, were, after they had gone through the Enlightenment, now looking for a way to return to a previous pure nation, right? An idea of a nationalist past, often a white one, and to do so, they would turn back to an imagined, perceived Middle Ages, and this is where you get the birth of a lot of different medieval alt-right myths. Inspired by Ivanhoe. M. Drewinski is correct. Distant Mirror actually have this on my bedside table. It's a really good book. It's a classic on this. I recommend that you read it. But directly inspired by Ivanhoe and excited about sort of like the ideas of knights and a white past and, sort of like a Christian restoration of the nation was D.W. Griffith, who wrote The Klansman, which then became the film, The Birth of a Nation. This was born out of this is a celebration of the Ku Klux Klan, which was born out of a deliberately feudal white aristocracy, which celebrated sort of an imagined white Anglo-Saxon heritage. Woodrow Wilson screened this in the White House. Woodrow Wilson was a friend of D.W. Oh, that's right, D.W. Griffith, excuse me. And also probably a white supremacist. Wilson, I mean, they probably all were, but especially Wilson. As you can see, there's like some obvious like knight imagery on this guy, and despite the fact that the KKK was a bunch of fucking morons at the best of times, D.W. Griffith sort of imagined them as chivalric knights protecting white women's virtue against savage hordes. It's worth noting that this is the second Klan. The first Klan had sort of like petered out, and D.W. Griffith was just so in love with the idea that he wrote this sort of romantic novel about a Klansman. And I must emphasize that this is all just made up out of whole cloth. The KKK didn't know anything about the Middle Ages. They just picked some words and symbols and were like, great, we're knights. This guy's the Grand Dragon. This guy's the Grand Wizard. And we're crusaders in Jesus' service. The Burning Cross had something to do with, the Burning Cross of Scotland, which is an idea that I think is just birthed from the depths of Griffith's mind. I think they're inexorably tied, Rasco 39K. I'm sorry, you're right. D.W. Griffith did the movie. The book was Thomas Dixon. I'm sorry. Thank you, M. Drewinski. That's right. Thomas Dixon wrote the book. D.W. Griffith made the movie. So we're going to see sort of a chain here. Inspired by sort of this Victorian Restoration, inspired by, this return to sort of like a white nationalist past, was Dixon and D.W. Griffith. And in turn, sort of inspired by them, were the Nazis. All right, everybody, here are the Nazis. Are you happy? I'm going to talk about the Nazis now. So at sort of the same time, in the 19th century, the Germany was undergoing a similar sort of like medieval restoration, an idea of restoring sort of like a German national identity, right? Which didn't exist, right? Germany was a patchwork of independent city-states, right? And it did sort of like become a unified country, quote unquote, in the late 1900s, but there wasn't really an identity. Everyone was a Berliner or a Municher or whatever. So people like Wagner start to sort of like create a mythos of Germany, right? The ring cycle, this idea about Siegfried, the knights, all these, the Valkyries, all these heroic German medieval figures. This is fiction. This is purely imagined. But the Nazis, when they come to power, are obsessed with this. They seize on this medieval imagery. They use things like the Sonnenrad, the sun wheel, to sort of like call back to a historical past. They invent the Iron Cross, or they use the Iron Cross and other images. Heinrich Himmler, who you see here, creates the Anerbe. I don't know how to say that. Which is basically like a think tank whose only job is to find medieval artifacts and prove how they were made by Aryans, by ancient Germans. There's a whole branch of philosophy called Ariosophy that is just basically, this is why Aryans are right about things. And it deeply undergirds the Nazi ideology that dork tank indeed, that sort of there's a medieval justification. There's an idea behind it. Yes, if you've watched the fine documentary Raiders of the Lost Ark, then yes, you know all about this. That's right, Death Priest. Communism is not so bad. That's right. That's what's radical about my views. So I'm sure you're probably seeing a through line here, right? Nationalists, white supremacists especially, find it very useful to draw upon the idea of a medieval past because they feel that it supports their view of the world, right? So especially medieval iconography, medieval phrases and ideas, again, what they perceive as medieval inspired ideas. These are sort of like the core of the white nationalist alt-right project. They are also not really based in anything, as I have made clear. I hope I've made clear. So sort of the recent culmination of this, right, is this idea that so in 1993, the American political scientist Samuel Huntington published an article in Foreign Affairs entitled "The Clash of Civilizations," which suggested that Islam and the West were incompatible and destined for conflict. This was a very controversial and very popular article, but it obviously gained special significance in after 9/11. And this is what George Bush had to say about that just 2 weeks after 9/11. M. Durinsky's right. F-tier academic. He sucks. He's bad. But turns out if you publish something like this, then people they interact with you. I mean, this is how you get engagement. He was ahead of the curve. So 2 weeks after 9/11, George Bush wrote or said in a speech, "This is a new kind of evil, and we understand, and the American people are beginning to understand. This crusade, this war on terrorism is going to take a while, and the American people must be patient. I'm going to be patient." The language of crusade was used quite frequently by Bush and by a lot of the people in the administration to sort of justify and explain what was happening. And this is carried on. in recent years, I feel like the fervor of the clash of civilizations narrative has slowed down, but this is still sort of just like part of our language. And this way of referring to our enemies in sort of like medieval terms is just baked into American discourse. Here's something that that Trump said in 2016, and I'm not going to do a Trump voice because I'm not as good. My Bush voice is better. We're living in medieval times, folks. Sorry, I'm going to do it anyway. We have to stop it. We have to be so strong. We have to fight so viciously and violently because we're dealing with violent people. Look, we have laws. And laws say you can't do that. You can't do that. You can't do that. You know, a lot. Their laws say you can do anything you want. And the more vicious you are, the better. So you can't do waterboarding, but they can do chopping off of heads, drowning people in steel cages. We have no leadership. You know, we have to fight fire with fire. And this is, this is just like a part of our discourse. And I think like what's obvious about this is that these ideas are useful to nationalists, to white supremacists. Trump obviously has said this. Le Pen, Bolsonaro. Weirdly, I don't know what Brazil's like medieval past is, but like, he's got, there's medieval references in a lot of his work. Deus DOLT shows up in Brazil more often than you would like. Putin erected a statue of Alexander Nevsky, the medieval hero of Russia. Erdogan, evokes a medieval past. Narendra Modi in India, evokes sort of like a Hindi past, Hindu heroes from the Middle Ages. This is, I think, like, it's obvious if you do any research at all, and if you're at all curious about the Middle Ages, that the ideas that are presented by the alt-right, by nationalists, by white supremacists, are horseshit. They're not based in anything. They don't hold up even under like the barest scrutiny. But our conception of the past is so shaped by our these collective mythologies, by our stories, and so little by actual history. And the truth is, I started this channel. I don't know if any of the Raiders are still here, but this is important if you want to hear it. I started this channel because I noticed that Steven Crowder had a video about the Crusades with 14 million views, which said something to the effect of the Crusaders did nothing wrong. It's honestly one of the dumbest things I've ever seen. I feel stupider for having watched it, but 14 million views. I get what, 24? And I love you all. You're beautiful. Thank you for tuning in. But like the thing is that people want to hear. They want ideas that reinforce their prior convictions. They want to hear things that are simple and easy to understand, and they want to hear things that, support their priors, their biases. And I want to make the thing that I want to emphasize. The Middle Ages were not perfect. This was, I would absolutely rather live now, even with everything that's going on, than I would rather live any time in the Middle Ages. But they were more tolerant, they were more diverse, and they were more interesting than we give them credit for. And the things that the alt-right, that nationalists are celebrating, these are modern ideas. These are ideas in the past 200 centuries, or Jesus Christ, 2 centuries, 200 years. I drank too much and I'm angry. It's just they're extremely modern ideas built out of sort of imperial taxonomies and attempts to establish sort of a bureaucratic control of the world and nature. And I don't know that there's anything for it, is the thing. Is I feel like historians have lost this battle for now. And the problem is that it's difficult to challenge this, and all of the sort of like challenges to this idea they're nuanced and they're complicated and they're difficult, right? they have nuance, and there's not an easy answer. And I think that, if people want to be, well, no, obviously these assholes should be run out of society. But I just, it's a disservice to our past. It's a disservice to the people who lived during that time. It's it's based on in summary, J Biddy, the Middle Ages are a land of contrasts. And it's just, I personally hate to see it. I hate to see the shields. I hate to see the Middle Ages things. I hate to see the Deus Volt and all the flags. It's just very depressing to me. It's based on a false idea of history, based around a false set of beliefs, to support a deeply reactionary and cruel ideology. It's just a bad idea of the world. I am bummed. I am bummed. I love history. I love, I think these people are interesting and complex, and that there's so much to be learned from our past that isn't, they were violent and cruel. I think it's so diminishing. I think it's just so narrowing. I think that it really closes windows on both our past, but also our present and our future. I think these ideas are deeply poisonous to our understanding of the world. I find it encouraging and exciting and interesting to read about people like, Hildegard or Hypatia, women philosophers from the Middle Ages, about the Convivencia, about Jewish rabbis and Muslim imams working together to, sharing philosophy. I find places like Byzantium and Iberia to be truly fascinating. The thing is that when you study history, right, it's a choice about what you emphasize. And I would just greatly prefer that we emphasize these interesting periods and these interesting people and these interesting times when people, despite not being as enlightened as we are, behaved much more in much more modern ways, who treated each other with respect and love and kindness, who tolerated gender identities that were not heteronormative, who did things that were that we have spent the last 100 years trying to fight to make legal. So that's what upsets me about it. That's what bothers me about it. And I mean, the Middle Ages weren't good. There's a lot of death and a lot of unpleasantness, but I'm pro looking at the Middle Ages as if they were better than we imagine them to be. And I am pro looking at the interesting parts of the Middle Ages as a counter to the prevailing view that they were universally cruel and dark and violent and repressive. The Middle Ages were complicated. And I think they have a lot to teach us. I think that there's a lot for us to learn because, I don't want to assume anything about you, but even I, before I started doing a lot of reading, had a lot of assumptions about what the Middle Ages were like. Vondelach, you missed the first part of my lecture, but that is true broadly. But if you lived past childhood, you could expect to live until about your 70s. Again, I also said before, I would still rather live now. Again, I would be dead. Sorry, guys, I had a brain tumor when I was 9. I would be dead anytime before the 1950s. So I'm happy I live now. I'm just saying there's a lot for us to learn and benefit from, and the past is a lot more complicated and interesting and valuable. It's not just a bunch of Deus Volting crusaders, killing Muslims. I will talk about swords. I will talk about something else I saw. Would have been cooler with dragons. I'm going to go get more whiskey. Thank you all for listening to me rant. This was a lot of fun. Stay safe. Don't get cooed. Don't get sick. I love you all. You're very special. Good night.